Welcome back to the devlog of my platformer game, where you descend into the earth facing increasingly difficult challenges. Last time, I added the final section of the asbestos mine level. I also changed the way I go about level design, now giving each subsection its own identity by focusing on a unique set of new ideas. This time, I used that methodology to completely transform earlier parts of the level. I also significantly improved the presentation with different tile sets and background details, but also with a new screen transition and intro text that involved working with shaders and drawing my own font. There's a lot to cover today, so let's get started. The first thing I'd like to look at is some of the level design changes. I was looking at the first part of the level and I realized it's kind of a mess. Many different enemies and hazards are introduced, most of them aren't properly explored, and much of the time the ways they're used are actively annoying. So essentially, I had to try and clean all of this up. I started by picking a few elements I wanted to work with, which ended up being the asbestos piles, the rock lumps, and the miners. Everything else I removed so that I could start from scratch. I decided to keep the first hallway mostly the same, because I felt it added a good atmosphere to the level. I also kept the first asbestos pile because it still serves its purpose of showing that it's safe to walk on. I moved the second pile to be much lower and recessed into the ground, where the player would find it natural to jump over, implying the asbestos is dangerous to jump on. The third asbestos pile doesn't have any of those cues, so if you didn't figure it out before, you're sure to figure it out now. Then there's an interesting platforming segment that leads into the first rock lump encounter. Unlike before where it jumped at you in the air, I changed it to now lunge at you on the ground, and telegraph its attack with its eyes flashing red. This makes jumping a more viable tactic, which creates an interesting dynamic when combined with asbestos. This is exactly what happens next. In this scenario, you have to be careful where you jump, meaning you'll spend a lot of time running over the asbestos to ensure the single platform in the middle is available. The next fight is very similar, except the rock lump starts out closer, meaning you have to jump over it first. These fights are a great use of the asbestos pile's unique properties, though admittedly they can be skipped by just jumping over the rock lumps. I'm unsure whether the player should be allowed to skip the fight like this, but that's something I'll have to think more about in the future. Next, you encounter the miner. It works just like it did before, where you have to attack it while dodging its pickaxes. You then fight another miner over some asbestos, where you can't use jumping as a method of avoiding attacks. And then you reach the end of the subsection. Personally, I really like the changes to this subsection. It feels more focused, meaning the gameplay is more in-depth. Along with the gameplay changes, I also added some visual changes, most evidently the indoor area. I think it adds more variety to the level, and also provides an opportunity to add more background details. My favorite being this poster that seems to bring attention to lung health, which has its own significance in the depths of an asbestos mine. The next subsection I changed is the bomber area. Most of it is the same, except with a couple of key differences. Now, you have to make a larger turn around the left side of the area and make a tricky jump, unlike before where it was much simpler. The final part also now features some bombers rather than another miner. I wanted the subsection to focus solely on the bomber, which seems reasonable since this is a shorter subsection anyways. Plus, I think the final challenge is more interesting, since it combines bombers in a very unique way. You have to avoid the falling bombs, but you can't just walk across because the floor is always unsafe. You also can't jump after the left bomb falls, since you'll get hit by the right bomb. Part of the challenge is observing the pattern until you learn that the best time to jump is in between both of the bombs. Here I also made some visual changes too, the largest one being the giant metal beams in the background. It's the largest sprite I've made for a background object, and I think it looks pretty good. If you actually take a second to look at the whole thing, its structure doesn't really make much sense, but it's mainly meant to just stay in the background and emphasize this sort of construction aesthetic. Next, we're going to move from the second subsection all the way down to the second to last subsection. If you remember last time, I was really disappointed by how bland the area looked, so I completely revamped the tile set. I said that this area should look like rusted metal, but I found that it would still be mostly unpleasant to look at, so I opted to change it to a more generic mechanical area. I achieved this by creating a set of border tiles that define the level boundaries, and a wide variety of internal tiles that can be used to add more variety within those boundaries. The most important of these internal tiles are the pipes, which allow the tiles to appear in clusters. In combination with the background tiles, this area looks very unique and interesting. I also made the exploding blocks gray to match the color of the falling blocks, and moved them slightly out of bounds to make it more clear that, hey, if you pull this lever, the ceiling is going to start collapsing from here, just like it did earlier in the subsection. Other than that, this area is still basically the same gameplay-wise, because it was very good to begin with. Lastly, I'll just mention the final smaller changes I've made around the level. In another subsection, based on some suggestions, I improved the wooden beam sprites, and added a table to go with the chair. In another subsection, I also added an additional background layer to add more depth. It's not too impressive, but I did have to make a system that can add and remove backgrounds based on where you are in the level. Overall, I've made some good progress, even if I didn't touch the middle portion of the level at all. Okay, now that that's done, I want to spend some time covering the work I've done on screen transitions and level intro texts. I'll start with the intro text, since it's the easier one to explain. I created a script that takes a font image and splits it into the individual letters. It then reads some kind of input text and draws all the corresponding letters with a provided spacing value. What's happening when the letters expand is that the spacing value is being gradually increased from 0. I'd say the more interesting process was actually making the font. I've made fonts like this before, and generally it's smooth sailing until you encounter one letter that you just can't get right. For me, those letters are usually S and B. Thankfully though, a lot of designs are derived from the same general format, which makes the process slightly easier. For example, C, G, Q, O, and U are all derived from a circle, more or less. Next is the screen transitions. How this works is that there's an object that draws a square over the whole screen, and a shader is applied to determine whether a given pixel should be black or transparent. With the shader, you can input where the dividing line is and how spread out the transition is. This can then be animated to produce a transition effect. But how are these circles created? Well, on a basic level, every pixel has a function applied to it that offsets it from the dividing line. This makes it appear to change earlier or later than the neighboring pixels. This function can actually be easily changed, which makes the shader very reusable. In this instance, the pixel is offset by the sine of its horizontal position multiplied by the sine of its vertical position. This creates waves in both directions that combine together to make circles. I think both of these effects look really good when combined at the beginning of a level, and I could almost say they look right at home in a finished game. Unfortunately, this game is still unfinished for the time being. I said previously that I want to finish the asbestos mine level as much as possible before I move on to other levels, so that I have a kind of proof of concept for how the game should be. The problem is that it feels kind of discouraging to be stuck working on the same level for so long, especially when I'm mostly improving what's already there rather than adding much new. Of course, there's definitely value in finishing a level, but I might consider starting work on a new one just for the sake of my sanity. It would also probably make the devlogs a bit more interesting to see some new scenery. Otherwise, that's all for now. If you'd like to keep up with future updates, please consider subscribing. Thank you. Bye.